Hello, everyone. Let's get started on our next to the last chapter. So this is week 14. See if I can get this to work. All right, why is it doing that? There it goes. Week 14. This chapter is on avian communities. And let's jump in here and take a look at this content. So first, let's talk about what a community is and what an ecosystem is, just to introduce the topic. So a community is just a group of populations. So we've already looked at populations in the last chapter. So this is a group of populations, meaning several different populations, usually many, many, many different populations of various species in the same place and at the same time. And this includes all species. And when we talk about communities, we're talking about every single species present in that place and at that time. All of those different populations. And then if we add in the abiotic components of that same space, we have an ecosystem, right? The interactions between all the various populations, so the community, and their environment. A lot of times, it's sort of easy to just say community when you're talking about some specific taxa, right? But like I said, this isn't just birds. So if we want to talk about some specific group of interest like birds, we might also more appropriately say a species assemblage. So the assemblage of bird species in an area um, that might be a better way to say that than the community of bird species, because the community really refers to all of the species in that area. When we look at communities, we're looking in specific places and times, but it is often valuable to look at communities at larger scales. And these are biomes. So biomes are just that. They're essentially communities at large scales that are defined by their location, the climate across that particular region, and whatever the climax vegetation structure is in that region. Right? So these are, as you can see from the map, these are very large scale things. You can see the Sahara Desert there in the north of Africa, for example, as one of the dry biomes and xeric shrublands. Uh, so there's going to be a very specific plant community structure within that region that is defined based on climate and soil conditions and the other things that are controlling the plant structure. And that's going to ultimately be very important in determining what other animals live there. Now, when we talk about communities, we are talking about both the plant and animal aspect. Okay, but when we define these biomes, we sort of define them more based on the vegetation, the primary producers of the system of interest. So, in West Virginia, we might describe in general as sort of a deciduous forest as being throughout a large proportion of West Virginia the primary type of uh, climax community, something like broadleaf deciduous forest. But if we were looking at the scale of just a significant portion of the Alleghenies, we might describe that more as mixed forest, and in some cases even purely coniferous forest if you're at a high enough elevation. So those, depending on the scale that you look at, the uh, the defining climax community of plants changes. Overall, biomes are these large regional averages. And so within any one of these biomes, there are many, many different ecosystems at play. If we just think about West Virginia again for a second, we might generically again say something like, oh, we have a lot of broadleaf deciduous and mixed forest. And that's true. But even at almost any scale you look at, there's some grassland, there is shrubland, there are wetlands, right? There's open water. There are many different biomes at play. So, but if you look at the average of the whole region, you wouldn't describe it based on each one of those individual characters, but it's overall character. That's the point. The community structure changes across space, across biomes. The community of a shrubland and the community of a deciduous forest and the community of a coniferous forest and of a desert, etc. These are all going to be different communities. And a lot of that is ultimately dictated by the vegetation structure and climate of a given area. So the same thing is true in terms of if we look across elevational gradients. If we were to look at tanagers in the Andes, for example, we would see that as we move further and further higher in elevation, the underlying structure in terms of the vegetative structure of the system as you move at higher elevation changes from lowland rainforest to, in this case, what it describes as a humid foothill forest, to the cloud forest, and then ultimately at the very highest elevations to elfin forest. And the tanagers that exist at each one of those levels are different, right? You go from a paradise tanager, an A, to a blue-necked tanager, to a golden tanager, and then ultimately to a blue and black tanager. So you see a shift in the species that are present as you move upwards. And so the community structure changes because as you change what species are present and what vegetation is present, of course, you're talking about change in the community structure. Sometimes these shifts can be quite abrupt. There are instances where the transition is really, really clear cut. Species that only exist in a narrow band of elevations or at only above a certain point or below a certain point in elevation. And those shifts are sometimes fairly abrupt. Like they might be quite commonly encountered, relatively abundant, all the way up to this one point and then they stop. So that's an abrupt shift in community structure. Well, on the other hand, most of the time is fairly gradual. So even like if we think of some of the different tag groups that we've looked at, and I've talked about like, well, this species is only found between X and Y elevation. The reality is for a lot of those numbers, those are the sort of generally those are where those species are found between those elevations. But in all actuality, you'll find they sometimes are a bit lower than that or a bit higher than that in elevation. And so there's really a gradual increase or decrease across the elevational gradient. It's not abrupt. So how do we describe communities? Well, one of the most typical things that we try to describe if we're a community ecologist is species diversity. And species diversity is just a description of the bird species found in an area or within a specific community that we're interested in. Two important aspects of diversity are the concepts of richness and evenness. Richness is extremely straightforward, and it's probably what I believe the vast majority of people think of when they hear the term species diversity. It's the total number of species in the area or community of interest. So it's just a count of the number of species. This idea of richness will come up again in a little bit. Species evenness is a measure of the relative abundances of each of the species in that area or that community that we're interested in. So just to kind of explain a little further how that differs, you can imagine we have species A, B, and C in a place. We're looking in two different places. And in the first place, there we find one individual of A, one of B, and one of C. Now we go to the second place and we measure the species A, B, and C again. We find one of A, one of B, but 10 of species C. My question is which one of those then is more even? Is it 1, 1, and 1 or 1, 1, and 10? And I think it's quite intuitive to say, well, 1, 1, and 1 is more even than 1, 1, and 10. The proportions of the individuals of the different species are much closer together. And in fact, they are exactly the same in the first example. So that's evenness. And evenness is important information about community structure. So communities that are extremely uneven or relatively uneven are going to have certain species that are far more abundant, that are the dominant species in the community. We can represent sort of this idea of evenness and abundance using the idea of plotting sampling effort. This is a species accumulation curve is what this is called. Plotting sampling effort and then the number of species that are actually encountered given sampling effort. So sampling effort means literally going out in the field and writing, essentially trying to find different species and recording what you find. You can imagine that you might imagine you're standing in a field, maybe a shrubby field or something. You can imagine very quickly that you might step out and detect song sparrows and field sparrows, for example, very, very quickly. The sampling effort is incredibly low. Almost the second you get out of your car and walk out into that field, you encounter them. Perhaps a little while later, after several minutes, you encounter crows and a red-tailed hawk flies overhead. So you've added on to that, but it's taken more effort because more time has passed. Now suppose that you spend many hours. Well, you may add other species to the list, right? And suppose you sample over many days or many seasons or even many years for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hours of effort. The idea is that the more you do that, the more and more species you should be able to add to the list up to some certain point upon which you have truly characterized the totality of all the species that exist in that community. Now, of course, we might not always want to look across. We might only want to look in a specific season, not across seasons, or in a specific time of year, not across many, many years. So depending on how you frame the diversity question that you're trying to answer will depend a little bit on what these efforts look like. But if we just imagine we're trying to characterize every single bird species we might reasonably encounter in this one location, we might sample over season and maybe several years, doing some sort of structured sampling across time, right? Like we're going to go out and we're going to do a 2-hour search across the property at different points or along different transects. And we're going to do that once a week, every other week for 3 years. And then we're going to use that as our data set to describe the diversity of this area. So you could do that. And what you would find is that essentially one of two sorts of things are going to happen, either this red line or this blue line. So the red line represents a species assemblage where you have relatively few species, and they're relatively easy to detect. So what do you see here when you look at this line, right? The sampling effort's very low, the line climbs extremely quickly, and then it flattens out. Essentially, you really stop adding species past this point. Whereas the blue line it goes up a little more gradually, but it keeps going and going and going, and it takes a long time to reach an asymptote because there are many rare species in this assemblage that require a lot of time to detect. Most most avian communities are going to be more like the blue line than the red line. Um, if you put in little effort, you might think it's more like the red line. You might go out for just a little bit, you detect a bunch of species, and you're like, oh, that's it. But as you put in the sampling effort, you will see that you'll detect more and more rare species in many communities with effort. Okay. Let's talk about abundance. So that blue line again is most typical in bird assemblages. So bird assemblages tend to have a lot of rare species where you get a few common species and then one or two of that thing and one or two of that thing and one or two of that thing. And there might be uncommon species. Maybe there's 5 of this thing or 5 of this thing, but they take a while to detect. A question might be, why are some species in this space much rarer than other species? Like why is there this unevenness in the distribution of species? And so there's a bunch of different potential reasons for that to occur. The first is that the survey site could be at the edge of the species range. So let's imagine, oh, if I could remember the name of that, oh man, I have a really good example of this. Is that Henslow's sparrow? I think it's Henslow's. Imagine that you're standing in a place where the edge of a species range is touching, so that at the edges of ranges you tend to have lower abundance because of that. We talked about that sort of gradient in species density across space, right? When you get to the edges, you tend to have fewer individuals than you do in the core of the range. Um, an example of this, I feel like I'm about to say the wrong sparrow name, so you know what? I'm just going to do this real quick so that I can actually say the correct sparrow's name. I'm almost sure it's Henslow's. I need to look at the range map real quick. Yeah, it's Henslow's. Okay. So in the northern panhandle here where I'm at, we're kind of right at the edge of Henslow's sparrow's range. And it's a grassland sparrow. And I went up to this WMA last year, and there's field sparrows everywhere. I mean, everywhere. Song sparrows everywhere. I hear this call I've never heard before. It's the only one I hear really anywhere around. It was a Henslow sparrow calling, which is pretty exciting for me because I really hadn't encountered one in the wild before. It's just they're not really abundant here. But it was the only one. So if I was measuring diversity in that place, and I was trying to account for why Henslow sparrows were so rare in that space, one of the things I might say is, well, we're sort of at the far periphery of the expected range for a Henslow sparrow. And that's why. Another possibility is the species sits at a high trophic level. So what this means is it's a predator, perhaps a significant predator like our red-tailed hawk, for example. You could not expect there to be as many red-tailed hawks as song sparrows in the same space. If you sit at a higher trophic level, it is simply impossible for you to exist at the same density as the things that you eat, for example. That's not possible because you have to eat many of those things uh, to persist. So your numbers have to be lower. So if we're talking about the hawks in an area, or maybe the falcons in an area, something like that, there's going to be less. The species could be a specialist, meaning that within the area you're at, maybe the species has very specific needs in terms of where it can make a nest. Just as one example, if there's only a couple features within the landscape that you're studying that have the necessary nesting uh, qualities that the species needs, then you're not going to have more than a couple of them, right? Like, you can't have more than what the landscape can support. So that's a possibility. A very obvious possibility, one that we talk about when we talk about conservation impacts, is that people may have negatively impacted the species that seems to be rare in your area, and it may only be rare because people have harmed it in some way, either directly or indirectly. Um, Another reason a species might be low is because of the cyclical nature of populations. Recall from the last lecture, we talked about how populations sort of ebb and flow, right? They move based on regulating factors. They move around that carrying capacity, which is set by limiting factors. And so you might be, since it goes up and down, you might be doing your observations at the down point, the downward inflection of the cyclical fluctuating population levels. So it might appear low, but if you come back over a period of a couple of years, you may see, oh, that population is starting to increase again. And if you track that long enough, you can actually see the ebb and flow of that population. And finally, it's a hard pill to swallow, I think, for some of us, but it's entirely possible that a species is rare just in general. It is globally a rare species. And we don't know why. We don't have a good explanation for why that species is rare. So there are a lot of reasons that these uneven compositions in species within a community can occur. I'm not going to talk about this in great detail. This is very, very, very basic stuff. But there are three kinds of diversity that we typically talk about: alpha, beta, and gamma. Alpha diversity is just species richness at a specific local level scale. If we're talking about scale, we're looking more locally at a specific, maybe specific ecosystem within a given region, something like that. Like we're going to go look at we have this patchy landscape, and we're going to look at the diversity in forests, and then we're going to also look at the diversity in grasslands, just as an example. And so we have each site that we pick can have its own measure of diversity, alpha diversity. We could compare diversity between our sites, right? So that's beta diversity. It's differences in the site-specific diversity across the region that you're studying. You can compare grassland to grassland and grassland to forest in every single site. So if you got 3 grasslands and 3 forests, you have many, many different comparisons you could make between the 6 different sites. And then finally, gamma diversity. Gamma diversity is much like alpha diversity, but it's at the regional level. So if we took all of the species from all the grassland sites and all of the forest sites and added them together and made one big species list or inventory, that would be the gamma diversity for that region. So one of the big things to understand is that there are some universal patterns to how diversity changes on a global scale. We already actually talked about diversity gradients because we talked about elevational gradients and how those can affect species diversity. But beyond simply elevational gradients, you also have latitudinal gradients. And this came up briefly in one of the very first chapters. We just sort of do an overview of diversity. In general, avian diversity is highest in the tropics. So it's highest around the equator and progressively gets lower and lower as you move to uh, higher latitudes, both in north and south direction. This is a general pattern, though. It is not an absolute rule. So, for example, seabirds at mid latitudes reach their highest diversity, not at the equator. And shorebirds reach their highest breeding diversity in very northerly and, or I should say, very, very high latitudes. That's the way to say that. So, if we look at different groups of birds as opposed to birds as a whole, we can paint a different picture. But in general, the trend is as you move away from the equator, overall avian diversity drops. This is true for most animal groups, at higher level animal groups, like in general. The tropics are the highest regions of diversity. Now, an important question to ask here is why? Why does that happen? And there are a few different hypotheses for why that might be. The first is perhaps the tropics are more stable. Particularly, they have maintained stability over, say, geological time. So, in other words, throughout the great geologic history of the tropics, there has been less fluctuation in climate and vegetation structure and things like that. That's a hypothesis, but it's really not particularly true. So we can think about events that have happened at our latitudes, things like glaciation events in our geologic history. And obviously those would have had tremendous impacts on the diversity of life in these areas as they were occurring. But the tropics have had their own very significant changes over time. There were times in the past where the tropics were much cooler than they are today, for example, where the predominant vegetation climax community would have been like a savanna or something like that. So that's probably not the reason, though it may be a little bit the reason. That might be contributing a little bit to it. There's a Pleistocene refugia hypothesis, and this is the hypothesis that during periods when the tropics were cooler and drier, more savanna dominated, that some of the ancient forest remained. Not all of it gave way to savanna. And in those places, ancient species became isolated, and you had these different patches of isolated species that then could speciate allopatrically, right? They're in different places, separated by savanna. And this is a really interesting theory, and there's probably some amount of truth to this, but there's been research that has shown by looking at DNA that many species started diverging before this particular period of time where these refugia would have been an important driver of this speciation. Some other possibilities are related to behavior. So in many tropical species, they're relatively sedentary, right? We don't see a lot of tropical migrators. things that tend to stay around the tropics all year round, they don't move as much. And it's possible that that sedentary behavior means, well, it's not, it just does. It means lower gene flow. Less movement means lower gene flow. And when you have less gene flow, you can speed up the speciation process, sort of like having isolated populations. When the populations don't exchange genetic information much, the chances of them diverging increases. So speciation increases, the rate of speciation. Um, this is a very reasonable hypothesis. It's all very true in reality that this all makes sense, I guess. It's logically quite consistent. But it is also true that in some instances, higher latitudes have actually shown higher speciation rates in different studies. So it can't be this by itself. And then finally, what about the extinction rates? So the idea here is that if we're around the tropics and extinction rates are lower than extinction rates in higher latitudes, then that could explain the differences in diversity. Ultimately, I don't know offhand of any studies that have looked at that. I feel like they probably exist and I just haven't read them. But this is another hypothesis as well. Most likely, in all reality, a mixture of these different factors plays some amount of a role in determining this very high diversity that we have in the tropics. And I should say, I think I skipped it. Let me go back real quick. The highest diversity anywhere on the planet of birds, at least what we believe to be the highest diversity, is in South America. So we are not too far away, relatively speaking, from the highest avian diversity on the planet. And that's in South America, where the Peruvian Andes meet the lowland Amazon rainforest. So if you want to go see the most possible birds, that's where you need to go. It's interesting. I think the book discusses a research station located in this region, and they had something like 319 listed species. And I run a station here in West Virginia, and I was thinking I've never actually tallied up the total number of species that I've encountered at the station, but it's got to be less than a third of that diversity. Um, well less than a third. I'm probably more like a quarter or so of that diversity. Just to give you an idea of just what kind of diversity we're talking about. It's probably a very exciting place to work in ornithology. So when you're talking about a place like that, like a super high diversity place, like in South America, one might ask themselves, how can so many different species coexist in the same space? Don't they start to fight with each other? That's a good question. So, indeed, the more species that you were to cram into a space, an ecosystem, the more likely for competition to occur, right? Resources, there's a limited number of resources, and those resources have to be doled out. If any of those resources are limiting factors, of course, carrying capacity for various competing species will decrease. The carrying capacity will drop. If we also know from much earlier discussions this semester, that if abundance drops below a certain level, we can get allele effects that come into play, and ultimately we can end up in an extinction vortex. And at least at local levels, we can have an extirpation event. So, how in the world can species in these highly diverse areas coexist? It's a really great question. To even begin to understand this, we have to think about something called niches, ecological niches. Now I will say niche. This is more the British way of saying this word. Uh, if you want to say ecological niches, you can say that niche. Sounds like NITCH. Either one, it doesn't really matter. They're both perfectly appropriate. I say niche because that's sort of how I learned it. So every species fills an ecological niche. What a niche is really is a set of the biotic and abiotic conditions that the species needs to survive. Another way to think of it, though, is that it's the role the species plays in its environment, or the space the species fills. And there are many, many aspects to this. It's not just diet; it's diet and habitat, at various, nesting habitat versus, wintering habitat, and it's it's the full breadth of all of that stuff. And we can think about these niches in two different ways. And I think it's valuable actually to think of them this way. There is a fundamental niche that each species has. And to imagine what that fundamental niche is, what you do is you take away all the competitors from that space. Like in an imaginary sense, you're imagining what the niche looks like. And so if you do that, the fundamental niche is the full range of environmental conditions and resources a bird could occupy, being unlimited by things like predators and competitors, right? So it's if there were no predators and no competitors, what space would this particular species occupy? Then there's the realized niche. The realized niche is the actual real world niche space that the species occupies when you put in the predators and the competitors and the different pathogens and things, the biotic things that are going to put limits on this species. So there's two different types of niche, but the realized niche is the one that matters from a practical perspective because it is the one that really um, exists in the world. Okay, niche breadth. So what's niche breadth? This is the range of resources utilized by a species. So it's food or habitat that they utilize. That's what it is. Usually it's expressed in those terms, food or habitat. Here we have an example of two very closely related species. One has a very narrow niche breadth, and one has a very broad niche breadth. So the rufous twistwing on the left is only found in dense mature bamboo stands. That's the habitat it uses. So its niche is narrow. It's focused on this one type of habitat. The brownish twistwing, these are both from Amazonia and South America, uh, is a generalist. It is found throughout basically the whole Amazon. In other words, it has great niche breadth. It does not require very specifically these bamboo stands of dense mature bamboo. And so this is where the ideas of specialist and generalist organisms come from. And you might ask, well, which is better? Is it better to be a specialist or a generalist? And the answer is that neither is better. If you imagine a very stable conditions, specialists in their particular specialization will outcompete generalists. So, for example, if the rufous twistwing is very, very good at hunting for food and gleaning food within these bamboo stands, then one may expect it to outcompete the brownish twistwing at the same task, right? Like if brownish twistwings are also in those bamboo stands, they're probably not going to be as competitive with the rufous twistwing at gleaning insects off bamboo, for example. I don't know if these are. I don't know what the hunting strategy of these birds is, so I would just say that outright. I haven't researched this species, so but it's just an example. Now, on the other hand, so that's in a stable situation, meaning that These bamboo stands, nothing's happening that's sort of changing the status quo within the environment. Now let's unstabilize things for a minute, or destabilize things for a minute. When unstable conditions uh, enter the equation, and especially if they are persistently unstable over long periods of time, it's hard for specialists to sort of ground themselves in a space and focus on their specialization because it's being disrupted by this instability. So what is instability? In this case, it could be something to do with an environmental factor that is causing bamboo stands to die, meaning these rufous twistlings are having to move to new stands all the time, and then they're um, getting into denser aggregates and having to compete with each other directly, and basically the normal status quo is disrupted. If you're a specialist, that is not good. Your ability to thrive is significantly hindered by that instability. If you're a generalist and that bamboo is harmed, for example, and let's say you were living in that bamboo, you're a generalist, so you're just as okay moving over to this patch of lowland forest nearby as you are in the bamboo. And so in that destabilized condition, you're actually better off. And that's the point. It depends on the stability of the environment and how long any stability or instability persists. Okay, niche overlap. So another important aspect of when we think about these niche spaces, if you imagine you take every species and you could make like a map of their niche space. It wouldn't be like maybe a literal map, but like a polygon in a multi-dimensional space. That's probably more confusing than just saying actual map, so just forget I said that. Just imagine a map, all right? And every single bird has this niche space map, and it accounts for what they eat, what type of habitat they require, all those things. You could stack all the maps on top of each other, right? And you would probably find that there are regions on those maps that would overlap with one another. That's niche overlap. It's the areas where two different species come together and compete for something. An example of this can be seen in the western North America with yellow-headed blackbirds and red-winged blackbirds, where the premium nesting habitat for these birds are cattail marshes with standing water. And so in the west, you have yellow-headed blackbirds, and yellow-headed blackbirds are quite a bit larger than red-winged blackbirds. They're about 25% heavier than red-winged blackbirds are. And because of this, they're able to push red-winged blackbirds out of these spaces. Basically, they dominate these premium breeding habitats. This, of course, pushes red-winged blackbirds out of this particular space and forces them to use what they would consider suboptimal breeding spaces. Now, this is not the case in the eastern United States. If you come far enough east and you get away from the yellow-headed blackbirds, red-winged blackbirds don't have that problem anymore. So this is an example of niche overlap, where you have two species that want to use the same habitat. And so there's competition for that habitat, and one pushes the other out. In staying on the same general topic, can you imagine a map where they were exactly the same? You have, your two birds, or however many birds, doesn't matter, but as you're stacking all your maps up, two of them are literally identical. They are perfectly identical, showing the niche space as essentially carbon copies. That is fathomable, right? Two different species having the same niche is fathomable. But here's the thing. We have this idea of the competitive exclusion principle. And the idea here is very, very simple. If two species exist with the same niche, one of them is going to go extinct. One of the species will be the better competitor of the two. And so you will get competitive exclusion of that individual. Finally, in keeping on to the topic of niche overlap, there is a concept called guilds. Guilds are a useful way for ecologists, community ecologists particularly, to describe groups of birds or groups of other organisms as well, based on, usually based on feeding characteristics where there is a shared feeding characteristic. But it doesn't have to be feeding characteristics. It could also be things like nesting habitat preference, things like that. So, as an example, we could group all of the birds that were conifer seed eaters together into a guild, the conifer seed eating bird guild, or all of the birds that glean insects from broadleaf deciduous trees, and that represents a guild. It creates a useful way of describing different groups of birds in terms of their niche overlap, and it's just a generally beneficial, useful concept. Okay, so the last part of this chapter is really heavily skewed toward discussing competition in birds and how that the implications it has for community structure. It's also quite beneficial. Beneficial, it's not the word I'm looking for. Quite extensive in its discussion of a few other things, particularly commensalism and mutualism, and some competition related concepts like density inflation and character displacement. So your discussion is on these topics. Here's what you have to do. You have to, using the ideas from that second half of the chapter, choose two different bird species, whatever two you want, I don't care, and for each one, find an example of any of these topics that you are interested in. It could be exploitation competition, interference competition, density inflation, character displacement, commensalism, or mutualism. But you find for each bird one example, and each bird should have a different example. So, for example, bird A has exploitation competition, then bird B should not have exploitation competition as the example. It should have one of the other 5 things that are listed here as its example. So you're going to do 2 birds. 1 paragraph per bird. That's it. You're going to describe the specific example in a paragraph. Just like this bird, this is the niche, and this is the the particular example of exploitation competition or whatever it is. Do that twice. You do that twice and you're done. When you do the response, you're just going to take one of your examples and compare it to one of the poster's examples, whichever you think was the most interesting. And that is the discussion for this week. So, if you have any questions, of course, as always, please reach out to me.